Hello, everyone, and welcome to my podcast, Travis's Best Life. I have just moved to Fishers, Indiana from Fort Wayne, Indiana area, and I'm living my best life. And this is my first podcast, and I have an awesome guest today. Dr. Stacy Lauderdale Littin is with us from the Low-Country Autism Foundation, and that is in Charleston, South Carolina. Is that right?
That's right.
Okay, so we'll go ahead and Stacy is also a BCBA doctorate level. So that's really cool. And we'll talk about that some later on. But go ahead and tell me about you and your foundation a little bit.
Okay. Thanks for having me on, Travis. I'm really excited to be here. I work for the Low-Country Autism Foundation doing family support services, which is basically families can call in and ask questions about anything from an initial evaluation to mental health support, resources in the community, job retention, job application process, pretty much anything that they need help with. That's what I can help them with. And then I also focus on some research and advocacy in the area.
That's very cool. And you touched on the mental health needs a little bit. And I would like to talk about that just a little bit because I know with autism, I'm on the spectrum myself, and I know that there are comorbid mental health needs quite a bit. What are some of the challenges that you face in helping someone with comorbid conditions in South Carolina? I know there are challenges here in Indiana, but I assume they're pretty much similar across the country, but I just wanted to touch on that a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'd say one barrier that we have is the Medicaid reimbursement rates here in South Carolina. So there are only a handful of providers who are actually able to support the community who's on Medicaid. I would say that's one of the barriers. Another would be an understanding of autism and really what is needed in order to support someone with autism. Because like you said, Travis, that there are comorbidities with anxiety and depression with autism. And then there's that social skill component too, where you want to make sure when you're addressing, a comorbid, whether it's anxiety or depression, that you're also taking into account, what comes along with having autism. So you're making sure that you're really addressing the whole person. So I would say professionals who really have an understanding of autism and the characteristics can be more difficult to find.
Yes, and I feel it's extremely important that people understand that social deficits can be both autism related and mental health related. So if you're really anxious or you're really depressed, you're going to have a social skills deficit. And I feel like it's important to know from an operational definition standpoint of, for those that aren't familiar with ABA, we'll talk a little bit about that, but operational definition is how we define a behavior so we can all work on it together. But I feel like it's important to know, is the deficit autism related or is it mental health related? Because I feel like that helps us know how to address it and things like that. So.
Absolutely. And I think too, one of the things like that you touched on, Travis, is I've spoken to some other adults and they will go say to a job or a social situation, and it will be so stressful for them to be in that social situation that they will then go home, and that will kind of exacerbate the depression. So some of these, situations kind of work together in order, it just leads to, they're so intertwined that it's really hard to piece apart what's what.
Absolutely. And I always think of depression. There's two types of depression for me. There's chemical imbalance, which is natural depression. But there's also situational depression. Like you talked about, if you lose a job, you're going to go home and be depressed and sit on that couch and do nothing for a couple of weeks, and things like that. So obviously we can treat depression with chemicals, medications, things like that, but also just working on social skills for me is the biggest way to treat depression, because I love to be out working on social skills and things like that. So super encouraging.
Love it.
I thought I would give, what I'm doing with my podcast is I'm kind of like asking my guests some questions, but I'm also giving my guests an opportunity to ask me some questions about autism. So if you have any questions for me, you're welcome to ask me anything at any time.
Okay. Well, I think one of my favorite things about talking to you is how you are so introspective and can share your experiences with other people. And I know from the families that I talk to, they're really interested in adulthood and jobs. And so I know that's something that you've already kind of touched on a little bit, and the social skill aspect of that. Like, what do you think people need to know in order to be successful in the workplace if they have autism?
Yeah, I really believe that people need to realize that it is a social disorder at heart. And so people are struggling to build these connections and struggling with social skills in general. So like when you're interacting with people at work, that's kind of like a job for us in itself, is interacting with people, as where typical people might find that natural. So like we're not only trying to focus on learning how to do our job, but we're trying to focus on learning how to socialize so that we can be appropriate at work and things like that. So we've kind of got two things going on. And also one of the things that I've really been touching on a lot lately is what I call the emotional sensory overload. We often think of like sensory overload in terms of physical senses, like taste, touch, feel, etc. But I feel like there's also an emotional component to that. For example, where I say my friend's having a bad day, I feel like they're having a really bad day, and I pick up on that like more intently. So sometimes I pick up on my friend's emotions more than they have their own emotions. So like, for example, I had a friend whose father passed away, and I was like wanting to send her flowers like every single day for like 2 weeks, and like wanted to make dinner for her like every single day for 2 weeks, and like just like overkill, like over the top. So my emotional response was like way overwhelming to what she was feeling, and what I should be doing. And when my emotional response is out of context, I talk about social context a lot, but when my emotional response is out of context with her emotions, then my social response, like the buying the flowers or like cooking dinner, is going to be out of context with what it should be as well. So like we're constantly dealing with social context and things like that, and understanding the social thinking aspect of it as well is very important.
What do you think the best way is to teach that?
I like I've been using like writing myself like social stories. So for example, like imagine there being like 10 levels of happiness or 10 levels of sadness, for that example of a friend's father passing away. So like level 10 is like the most sad, and level 1 is like the least sad. And she might be at like level 6, but in my brain, I'm very black and white, so I can only recognize level 10 or level 1. And so like if I come in at level 10 and she's at level 6, I'm going to be over the top. So like I need like a social story to help me explain what level 6 is, because I can visualize level 1 and I can visualize level 10, but I just need like social stories for levels 2 through 9 so that I can have a visual image. Like I think in pictures, like Temple Grandin. So if I can have a visual image of like what the gray area is, then I'm more likely to be able to comprehend it and understand it. And then once we have that visual image, naturally my social response might be a little bit more appropriate, but we might also have to work with me on like social skills to match those different levels as well. So.
Did you say you wrote them?
I have been starting to, yes, I'm starting to write them. So
very cool. What have you written them about?
Just like, for example, like I've been looking at different images of people's faces for like happiness and frowns, and like imagining like, well, this face might mean they're like at level 1. This face might mean they're at level 5. This face might mean they're at level 7 or level 8. And then like writing like a social story to be like, well, this is what they might be feeling if they're at that level. So like say someone's dog is sick. I wrote a social story about their dog being sick and why they might be feeling at level 4. And then like kind of like matching social skills, like write about social skills that go with that to kind of like interact with them, how you would comfort them and things like that. So I'm really working hard to learn like social boundaries. And so I'm practicing these social stories that I'm making up to kind of help me with these boundaries and learning how to navigate social relationships.
Are you finding it difficult to write the social stories? Are you doing it by yourself? Are you having somebody help you?
Yeah, I've been doing it by myself. And it is difficult because because I'm so black and white, it's hard for me to imagine the grayness of it. And I tend to do like what we do, overgeneralize. We talk about ABA for a little bit, overgeneralize. So like something might be at level 5, but my response is I overgeneralize my response to like level 10. So like I generalize up to level 10, or I generalize down to level 1 because it's always black or white. And so like I have a hard time generalizing to level 6 or level 4. And so my stories are very like rigid because they're very black and white so far. I'm trying to bring them down to where they're in between in the gray area.
And I do have to say that this is something that a lot of people struggle with is, understanding how somebody else is feeling if you haven't also experienced that yourself. So, I mean, it can be very hard
Right.
to be able to do that.
It's kind of like what we call the term mind blindness a little bit. You don't understand what somebody else is feeling. And
Right.
putting yourself in their shoes is very difficult.
Yep. Yep. I agree. Well, that's very cool. I didn't know you were doing that.
Yeah, I just started doing that this past couple weeks actually, so it's pretty exciting. Um, so yeah, why don't you take a minute and tell me a couple of things that are coming up for your foundation, the Low-Country Autism Foundation, a
Okay.
couple of events that you guys have going on. We can talk about those a little bit.
Sure. So we just had a really big fundraiser, and it was at the Daniel Island Club in Charleston. And we raised funds in order to be able to offer free programming. So one of the things that we offer, for example, is free swim lessons.
Okay.
So and free music therapy. So these are just supplementary services, not necessarily focusing on evidence-based practices when we're offering these supplementary services, but it's just ways for individuals with autism and their families to be able to go into the community and, access services and meet each other. We also try to meet the needs of everyone in the family. So we have a dad support group. We also do something called Laugh on the Wild Side, where it's a dad and then an individual with autism, and they'll do things like kayaking, or I'm so sorry, my dog is going crazy.
That's all right. No problem.
And so we also offer free yoga for families. So raising money in order to be able to offer those services. Upcoming in April, we have something called Ales for Autism, which is in Bluffton, South Carolina,
Okay.
and that is to raise money for services in that area because it's about 2 hours from here. And it's a golf tournament and fundraiser as well.
Okay. That's pretty cool. Very exciting. It's good to be coming out of some of this COVID lockdown so that we can start doing some social events again, social gatherings.
And that what I find people are really missing the most is the opportunity to socialize, meet other people, talk to each other, and especially families who have had an individual diagnosed over this last 2-year period. They haven't really had the opportunity to be able to meet other families.
Absolutely. I was curious about that actually. Have you noticed, have families noticed, in your opinion, is it harder to get a diagnosis now during COVID than it was before COVID? How is that? Is there a longer wait list now? How is that going on?
Yes, it is much more difficult, and there's actually a huge wait list now. So we have found that because they had to stop with the diagnostic process, that it's much more difficult now.
Interesting. And we know how important that delay is going to hinder us in our growth. So I was curious what you would say to say you've got a parent who's got a new child, newly diagnosed, and they're considering ABA therapy, but they're getting all these different feedbacks from like autistic adults and stuff like that who are kind of negative about ABA. So what would you say, like, to help convince someone ABA is person-centered and like how it really can help teach social skills and self-advocacy and things like that? What's your advice to new parents who have a kid who's newly diagnosed?
I am very glad that you asked that. I would definitely say ABA is the gold standard in terms of autism intervention. And I would encourage families to go meet with an organization and talk to them about the needs of their family, because many times the problem behaviors or even communication can be addressed utilizing ABA. And there's so many different interventions that are based on the science of ABA. So ABA being the umbrella, and all of these different interventions going underneath the umbrella. So I would just say you need to try it for yourself. Everyone's experiences are different, but if you get a good team and people who understand your needs, your family's needs, your child's needs, you really are going to be able to increase the quality of life of the whole family. And there are so many different interventions that fall under this umbrella, that there is something to address each behavior that you really want to focus on.
Absolutely. And I always find it fascinating that I think some people think that ABA is like the science of autism because they think it's like just for autism, but it's really the science of behavior, right? We're studying behavior, we're not studying autism. It just happens to work well with kids who are have some challenges socially. Now, I was talking to a parent a couple of days ago, and one of the reasons why they were not so sure about ABA was because they said, well, it only focuses on the immediate antecedent. So like what triggers meltdown is the event right before the meltdown. And a lot of times we know, good ABA knows that that's not always true. It could be something that happened 2 days ago or like, a week ago that triggers a meltdown. So like I had a parent, I was trying to convince them that good ABA therapists actually care about the sequence of events leading up to the meltdown as opposed to just the immediate antecedent. It was a fascinating conversation.
Well, I also think the important thing to consider also is that good ABA not only focuses on the antecedent, but also focuses on the consequent and then focuses on the teaching of new behavior. So I think it's really a combination of what's happening before, what's happening after, and then what you can do to teach new behaviors in order to be able to control for the outcomes.
Yeah, and it's also important, I think, to understand the MO, the motivation behind the behavior as well. So I always am fascinated by that. Good ABA really cares about the fourth term of the contingency, I feel like, and that's very important to me as a person with autism, because it's always nice to know that someone cares why you're doing this as opposed to just trying to eliminate the behavior or change stop the behavior from happening. So yeah, now I was thinking back to our conversation we had a couple of months ago, because I've known you for a while now. I've spoken in some of your classes. So you teach at the college level.
I
And
do.
if I remember correctly, you have a sabbatical coming up. Is that right?
I do. I'm very excited.
I bet. So have you thought any further about what you're going to do, like during your sabbatical, studying wise, or?
Yes. So what I would really like to do, there's a couple of things that I'm going to do in order to help prep for the sabbatical. One is I want to get parents and individuals with autism. I want to get their thoughts on sex education, because I think that's something that's extremely important. And I think that it's something that we need to start touching on, when individuals are very young, so that we can make sure that we're creating safe spaces and understanding circles of friendship and things like that. So I'm going to send out a survey that's going to ask people's opinions of information that they would like to learn or things that they're struggling with in order to start working on that. That's something I'm interested in. And the second thing is, also, my research partner, Mary Haspel, and I just did a paper on some soft skills for jobs for individuals with autism. And I would really like to, here in Charleston, start an adult group in order to work on soft skills for employment. At least here in South Carolina, there are not that many opportunities to work on that. And I think it's a huge area of need. What do you think?
Yeah, it's definitely a big area of need. So like, I know I've been able to, for example, with job interviewing, I've been able to kind of like train myself how to do like job interviews, but then that's like, well, I can get any job that I want because I mastered the job interview process, but it's like, now I got to keep the job and I don't have the soft skills to be able to keep the job. So I always end up like escaping because I'll end up like wanting to form a relationship with someone and not knowing how to do that properly. I will just quit and like escape, as opposed to trying to work through that and build through some of those boundaries and stuff like that. So I always find it fascinating because a lot of people tell me, you talked a little bit about sex education, but a lot of people tell me that there's this rule that you shouldn't date people that you work with. But yeah, it's funny because I know a lot of people that are married to someone that they were working with. So I find that neurotypicals are very fascinating because you're very good at making up these rules, but you're also very good at breaking your own rules and like
That's
going
very
that
true.
route as well. So
That's very true. Yeah.
for
I
someone with
mean,
autism, we have to learn how to follow your rules, and then we have to learn how to break the rules. So
right.
that's very challenging.
It is and you know what, as bringing that up, even if you said which rules could you break and how would you do it, I don't even know that I would be very good at explaining that.
Right.
It's difficult.
Right. I think something that would be fascinating for your research would be to also include like a little diagram or a little part of your research where you're asking neurotypical people to describe, well, what kind of things like sexuality wise make you uncomfortable. So like, for example, I've always had girls tell me that like Travis, you're creepy nice, or you're creepy. But yet people have a hard time defining what that is.
Right.
Like I've always wanted someone to be able to write me a book that tells me this is what you're doing that's creepy and making me feel this way.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe like a little survey, you know, like asking people, well, what kind of things make you feel unsafe or make you feel creepy around someone, a new person?
Right.
Things like that would be very interesting, I think.
That would be very interesting. I wonder how you might do that and make sure, you brought up operationally defining earlier,
Right.
which is making sure that we're all seeing the behavior the same way and defining it the same way. I found that that's something that's really difficult for people. So like you were saying, they might call it creepy, but they can't necessarily operationally define what creepy is.
Right.
So I wonder how we could get a list of things maybe for people to choose from that are already operationally defined so that we make sure that we're understanding what those things are. Because I might be able to say, like if I'm out, this creepy to me might have been someone staring me in the eyes for longer than 10 seconds or something like that. That might make me feeling without looking away.
Right.
And that would be a good operational definition. But I find people really struggle with being able to express that.
Yeah, I think I think people are just uncomfortable talking about it because I think it really, when we start talking about creepy, I think it does fall into the sex education piece of it. And people are just really uncomfortable explaining, like they would rather just tell you you're weird instead of like explaining why you're weird and things like that. So it's very fascinating to me that people operate that way and they can't explain it.
Yep, that's true. And they also operate differently depending on how they feel about someone, right? So if they're really interested in someone, something that might seem creepy from one person is not creepy by that person because they feel a certain way, but then you have to be able to recognize those signs too.
Right. It's all in the context of the situation. It really is.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's true.
Yeah.
Well, and some of the soft skills that, in terms of the workplace, were like teamwork, networking, professionalism, problem solving, critical thinking. Are these things that I know you've mentioned before that you have somebody, an ABA professional who you've worked with? Have they touched on any of those things before?
Yeah, we started working on them a little bit now. I've just gotten to a bigger city where I've got more services now, which is really fascinating. We're working on some soft skills, and we are going to be looking at jobs and things like that. And but I really am like focused on. I think it's funny because like I love Peter Gerhardt. He tells a story about how he makes it a team effort at work. So he like all of a sudden he had this kid one day with autism, and it was like everybody was walking up to him and giving him a high five, and he couldn't figure out why they were paying attention to him all of a sudden. But the employees turned it into like a coin machine, like a competition, to where it was like, who can get John to say hi to me back the most? And that was really fascinating to me that they were engaging the coworkers. And one of the things I think that we're going to start to see developing in the near future is people with autism doing more trainings for employers. Because I mean, we're the best people to train the employer on how to interact with us and to train our coworkers on how to interact with us and things like that. So I've put together some presentations for potential employers that I'm going to be applying for positions with as well. So I'm very excited about that.
That would be a cool research study too.
Yeah, definitely. I just think that like the little nuances, like we talked about, I think you mentioned, I spoke to the Low-Country Autism Foundation a couple weeks ago. I think you mentioned that you work drive-through at Wendy's as well.
I did.
So like there's just the constant, you can talk to each other inside, and people are always making jokes. And like when you talk about sexual education, there's always all those sexual innuendos going on and things like that. And it's like, as a person with autism, you want to feel included in that, and you want to like joke around with everybody, but you don't know how. And that's a very touchy, the sexual innuendos. That's a very touchy subject to say the wrong thing on, and things like that. So we need to make people with autism more comfortable. And it's interesting how everything goes together. So like the sexuality education also goes together with the job skills, the soft job skills, because you really do have to be educated sexually to be able to work in a work setting, unfortunately, because there's a lot of those innuendos going on and things like that. So it's interesting how it all folds in together and works together.
It really does. And, I think too, knowing what's available in order to teach those skills and learning from somebody who has autism the best way in order to teach those skills is really, really important.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's all about like it's a very gray concept, so we have to figure out how to teach like the middle ground behaviors. All or nothing thinking gets us into trouble sometimes, and we just have to work on like I don't know how to explain it, but there's got to be a way to work on operationally defining the gray area, the gray content. And I think we put so much focus on like yes or no or like choices, but yes, two choices, like you can do this or you can do that. But the problem with that is in life there's actually thousands of choices to make at the same time, and it's really hard to design a person-centered program that focuses on all those choices because we just have limited amount of time with the person.
That's absolutely true. And, being able to determine what all of those choices are, because I think sometimes all of those choices move through your mind so quickly that some of them you don't even realize, would come to mind because you're filing through them so quickly that you don't even realize that that might have been
Right.
a choice that you just passed right by.
Right, and I think my understanding is that as a neurotypical, you kind of make those choices nonchalantly without even really thinking about it. As for someone with autism, might sit there and process that choice for like a minute or two to try and make that decision.
Mm-hmm.
So it's very
So,
fascinating.
can I ask you another quick question? And this is a little bit off the topic, what we were just talking about.
Yeah, for
Um,
sure.
I do the police trainings here.
Hmm.
And basically, they're wanting information if they come into contact with someone with autism in the community. What are the things that they should know? If you were to tell them like 5 things that they think they should know that would help me train them and help them in the community, what do you think those might be?
Yeah, I encourage them to get peers involved. So, like, we're doing a program here in Indiana called 98. Well, 988 is a national thing now. It's going to be like the mental health helpline. But in Indiana, I'm on the committee. We're helping implement that. And one of the things that I'm encouraging is that we get peers involved and like so adults with autism maybe go out with the police officers into the community to help bridge that interaction. Um, but the first thing that I think the police should also know with autism is there's going to be comorbid mental health conditions involved. Um, and someone with autism, they have to also know the second thing is that it's a very wide spectrum. So someone with Asperger's is going to respond completely different than someone who's nonverbal. Um, and also, people with autism don't necessarily know that they should just stop and put their hands up without being told
Right.
or asked to. And it's better to ask us than to tell us. So, like, the command stuff isn't really going to be very effective because we're going to be so anxious. We're not going to respond to that. And then just focused on, like, not touching, obviously, not getting too close, sensory overload, things like that. And then understanding that when they do ask us questions, there's a great scene. There's a movie called Adam. It's about a guy with Asperger's syndrome. I don't know if you've seen it yet.
I
It's
haven't.
from 2009, but it's a really great scene. He's at a park and he's like watching the children play on the park. And the kids they're playing, and the police come up because there's this guy staring at these kids at the park, and they ask him, "Well, what are you doing?" And he says, "I'm watching the children." And obviously, like neurotypical wise, like they interpret that they think they know what he's doing,
Sure.
and he's really just watching the children and observing, kind of like trying to learn how to interact and things like that. But they think he's a predator because he says, "I'm watching the children." So like, don't take everything that we say literally, and try to investigate the situation a little bit more to find out what's going on and things like that. So that's very
Those are
important as
great
well.
tips. What about the use of visuals? Do you think that would
Yes,
be
visual aid
helpful?
would be very, very helpful. So like, and do it within the context too. So like, don't just go to a training and train me on the visual aid, but like take visual. If you're on a crisis call, take visual aids with you, and like this is like explain the diagram and explain this is what we're trying to get you to do, and draw the visual out and maybe make it into like a social story within the right context of the situation. So that's very
Very
important as
cool.
well.
Thank you. I'm always looking for new things and new information to provide them because they really do want to help and do the right thing.
Oh
Um,
yeah.
but sometimes they're just not sure, especially with what you said with the mental health and autism. Sometimes if they don't know the person has autism, they you know,
Right.
they always ask me, how am I supposed to know if they're not able to tell me?
And another thing that I'm encouraging as well is, I feel this is very important, is that because I've been on the receiving end of some crisis calls, where I've been the one they were coming out to deal with
Mhm.
or help, and I think it's very important that the city police officers are getting the exact same training as the county police officers, because as someone with autism, if you approach me as a county officer completely differently than your city officer approaches me, I'm going to have a meltdown because you're doing something way different. So it's very important that the city and county and state troopers all have the same crisis intervention training as well.
Awesome. So the continuity is a really important piece.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you for that. I'm going to use that tomorrow. I have a training tomorrow, and I'm actually going to look at that movie and see if I can't find it.
Oh yeah, you
That
should
sounds
show
pretty
that. Like,
cool.
use that as a
Yeah.
visual if you can. Show the clip.
Yeah. That's what I was thinking. I'm like, that would be a great addition to the
Yeah,
presentation so they can actually see an example.
definitely, definitely. All right, Stacy. Well, did you have any other questions for me?
No, Travis, it's always such a delight to talk to you. I'm sorry about the crazy dog and the vacuum. I know that did not help the middle of our podcast here, but I am so grateful that you asked me to come on your inaugural podcast.
Yes, this is my very first show, so I'm excited about that. And it's always good to talk to you and have you on the show. And I look forward to continuing to work with you and further educate people about autism.
Absolutely, Travis. Thank you so much.
All right. Well, thanks so much for coming on.
Bye.
Bye now.